Hello everyone and welcome back to the Dungeon Learner's Guide. Today we've got another Commander's Guild deck tech. This is deck number 207 and it's titled Lost to Phyrexia. And if you haven't seen this show before, what we're doing is randomly selecting a card from scryfall.com or from among suggested cards, working with a budget of $100 or less and building a commander deck for Magic the Gathering around a theme of the chosen card. So, this week, our random card was suggested to us by Minchang Kim over on YouTube, and that is Mishra claimed by Gix. Mishra is 2 black-red for a legendary creature, Phyrexian Human Artificer. He's a 3/5. Whenever you attack, each opponent loses X life and you gain X life, where X is the number of attacking creatures. And then, if Mishra claimed by Gix and a creature named Phyrexian Dragon Engine are attacking, and you both own and control them, exile them, then meld them into Mishra Lost to Phyrexia, it enters the battlefield tapped and attacking. So there is a lot of text on this card, but the important thing to remember is that since we are building around this card, obviously the easiest way to do that is to make it the commander, and I'm sure you can probably already guess that we do also have the Phyrexian Dragon Engine in the deck as well. So that means that if we are able to manage to flip them, they'll turn into Mishra Lost to Phyrexia, which is a legendary artifact creature Phyrexian Artificer. It's a massive 9/9. And whenever it enters the battlefield or attacks, choose 3 from among target opponent discards 2 cards. Mishra deals 3 damage to any target, destroy an artifact or planeswalker. Creatures you control gain menace and trample until the end of turn. Creatures you don't control get -1/-1 until end of turn, and create 2 tapped Power Stone tokens. Now, it's obviously going to be very difficult for us to meld Mishra considering we are reliant on a card that's not in our command zone, but it's still going to be one of those things that if we're able to do it, can most likely push us toward a victory, even discounting everything else that's in our deck. Now, with that in mind, though, there are a ton of different ways that we could build around Mishra, so I want to break down our major themes for this deck and talk about where we went with this deck during construction. The very first thing that's worth mentioning is that we are first and foremost a Reanimator deck. That means that we are leaning heavily on cards like Animate Dead, which is 1 and a black for an enchantment aura, enchant creature card in a graveyard. When it enters the battlefield, if it's on the battlefield, it loses enchant creature card in a graveyard and gains enchant creature put onto the battlefield with Animate Dead. Return enchanted creature card to the battlefield under your control and attach Animate Dead to it. When Animate Dead leaves the battlefield, that creature's controller sacrifices it, then enchanted creature gets -1/-0. So that is a lot of text to basically just say that we get to reanimate any creature from a graveyard. Now, most of the time that is going to be our creatures, but there is a chance we can hit our opponent's things as well. But really what we want to do with this deck is keep getting value by putting things into our graveyard and then getting them back out. And while that doesn't look like it initially synergizes well with Mishra, those dots will kind of come back together once we start connecting in with theme number 2, which is going to be artifacts. And there's a lot of artifact reanimation synergies in mono black that we are really leaning into. The main reason that we're doing that is because we want to be able to get the Phyrexian Dragon Engine from our graveyard onto the battlefield, which is going to let us draw cards and possibly meld Mishra, but it also means that that is a prime target for our opponents. There's a very good chance that it dies. There's a good chance that we lose Mishra at some point. We've got to get it back. So we are going to use cards like Technomancer, which is 5 black for a 5/1 artifact creature Necron wizard. When it enters the battlefield, mill 3 cards, then return any number of artifact creature cards with total mana value 6 or less from your graveyard to the battlefield. This puts us in a situation where if we have loaded up our graveyard with a ton of artifact creatures, we can just kind of drop Technomancer and get a ton of creatures back kind of out of nowhere. And a lot of the artifact creatures actually reward us for having them enter from the graveyard. It's specifically worded on a lot of them that it's when they enter from a graveyard, not if they are cast from a graveyard. So Technomancer lets us get kind of some extra value And then we also get to flood the board with a lot of little creatures that are just gonna start to churn through our opponent's life totals when we're attacking with them and Mishra. But that is only theme number 2 in the deck. So we've got our reanimation, we've got our artifact targets, and then finally we have specifically things that care about coming into play from the graveyard. I mentioned this with our artifact creatures, but we also have things like Flayer of the Hatebound, which is 5 and a red for a 4/2 devil. It has Undying, and whenever it or another creature enters the battlefield from your graveyard, that creature deals damage equal to its power to target creature or player. This is one of those cards that if it goes unchecked, can basically just win us the game. Because you've got to keep in mind that it's dealing damage equal to its power, not its mana value. So if we can cast, say, Animate Dead on Technomancer, Technomancer comes into play, we do 5 damage to anything that we want, and then the Technomancer can get other cards out of our graveyard, which will then come in, trigger Flayer of the Hatebound, and then we're able to continually do damage in ways that our opponents, one, may not be expecting, and also, they may not be able to deal with, because we can get rid of problem creatures, we can just burn our opponents out, and even if they try to kill the Flayer, it just comes back with Undying anyway. So this is a great way for us to continuously burn out the table, and it's one of those ways that no matter what our opponents do, unless of course they exile our graveyard, but please don't do that. We're a graveyard deck, we don't want to die. But unless they use exile, we can probably bounce back from anything that they throw at us. And that's kind of what we want to do, because we want to try to meld Mishra and we want to do a ton of damage with our attackers. So with all of that being said, let's move on from our themes and get into some of our key cards and talk about some of the MVPs of this deck. So the very first card that I want to highlight is going to be Gravebreaker Lamia. This is a card that I have thrown into so many decks in the past because I genuinely find that it overperforms most of the time. It is 4 and a black for a 4/4 enchantment creature Snake Lamia. It has lifelink. When Gravebreaker Lamia enters the battlefield, search your library for a card, put it into your graveyard, then shuffle, and spells you cast from your graveyard cost 1 less to cast. We have a lot of artifact creatures that can unearth themselves or can find other ways to bring themselves back from the graveyard, so Gravebreaker Lamia's discount is actually very relevant as this game goes on, because you'll find that a lot of our cards, while they don't necessarily cast themselves a lot of times, there are ways that we can let them cast themselves, or maybe find ways to cast spells from our graveyard, meaning that we will still get that discount. The other thing that's so important about the Lamia is it searches our library for any card we want and puts it into our graveyard. We can get creatures, we can get artifacts, we can get enchantments, instant sorceries, lands, it doesn't matter. If we need it and have a way to get it back, then the Lamia can get us whatever we need at any specific moment. I think that alone makes it worthy of a key card spot, but then the discount on spells just kind of kicks it up another notch. Moving on, though, to our second key card. This one is Chainer Nightmare Adept, and Chainer is one of the best reanimation spells we have in the entire deck, just because of how frequently we are able to use it. So Chainer is 2 black-red for a 3/2 legendary creature human minion. You can discard a card, and then you may cast a creature spell from your graveyard this turn, activate only once each turn, and whenever a non-token creature enters the battlefield under your control, if you didn't cast it from your hand, it gains haste until your next turn. So Chainer is one of those cards that lets us cast spells from our graveyard even though they may not be able to be cast from our graveyard, meaning that anything we cast with Chainer does get the discount from Gravebreaker Lamia. But because there's no real restrictions on Chainer's ability, it is incredibly powerful in this deck. Yes, we can only activate it once per turn, and yes, we do still have to obey the timing restrictions, but being able to cast a creature for free, well, not technically for free, you do still have to pay the mana cost, but by free I mean we don't have to spend additional value to cast that thing. Meaning that we can cast a creature, and then if it dies, it goes right back to our graveyard. There's nothing about exiling it, there's nothing about returning it to our hand. we just get a free reanimation. Again, not free in the sense that we're not spending mana, free in the sense that we don't have to do anything extra. And we can do that every single turn. Chainer then gives those things haste when they enter because we cast them from our graveyard, not from our hand. And it's also worth mentioning that the specific wording on Chainer also gives our commander Mishra haste when we cast him from the command zone. So if we have the Phyrexian Dragon Engine and Chainer, we can kind of sneakily meld our commander by casting the engine, casting Mishra. They'll both get haste because of Chainer. Then we attack, meld, and probably put ourselves in a position where it's very difficult for our opponents to win. Moving on though, we get to our final key card, and this one is going to be, of course, the Phyrexian Dragon Engine. It's kind of impossible to build a Mishra deck and not have this be one of our key cards. It is 3 mana for a 2/2 artifact creature Phyrexian Dragon. It has double strike, and when it enters the battlefield from your graveyard, you may discard your hand. If you do, draw 3 cards, then it can unearth for 3 red. This is one of those cards that it doesn't actually do anything when you first cast it, but when you play it from your graveyard, you get that additional value. You get to discard your hand and draw 3. Now, a couple of key interactions that I want to point out with the Phyrexian Dragon Engine. Its unearth ability is 3 red, so 5 total mana, but if you use something like Chainer, you can cast it for its normal casting cost, which is just 3 generic mana, meaning that we have plenty of ways to cast it very cheap, very efficiently, and in a way that won't automatically kill it. Because if you unearth it, you have to exile it at the end of turn, or if it would go to your graveyard in some other way. So if we don't meld that turn after we've unearthed it, it's gone forever. So that is something to be aware of, and definitely one of those things you really only want to do in a worst case scenario, because you really want to keep the Dragon Engine around. It's probably one of our best ways to win with Mishra. Now, those are all of our key cards. So the next piece of our deck tech, we're going to talk about some cool interactions. These are cards that synergize really well with each other, and in some cases are just fun or value or just generically entertaining cards that I think are worth highlighting in this deck. So the very first cool interaction that I want to highlight is going to be between Thran Vigil and Murderous Redcap. And I feel like this interaction is going to be a very different definition of fun for me than it may be for some other people, because this is an infinite combo that does win the game. So Thran Vigil is 1 and a black for an enchantment that says whenever 1 or more artifact and or creature cards leave your graveyard during your turn, put a +1/+1 counter on target creature you control. Then Murderous Redcap is 2 black red for a 2/2 Goblin Assassin. When it enters the battlefield, it deals damage equal to its power to any target, and it has Persist, which means when it dies, it enters with a -1/-1 counter. The way that Thran Vigil interacts with Murderous Redcap is when the Redcap would enter with its -1/-1 counter, all we have to do is have any other creature that would also persist or maybe die and come back, and then we can put a +1/+1 counter on the Murderous Redcap, which then cancels out the -1/-1 counter, so if it were to die again, it would immediately come back, and then we can just kind of infinitely do damage to our opponents, because the Redcap will die, it'll come back, the Vigil will put the counter back on the Redcap, it'll do 2 damage to an opponent, we can sacrifice it, do it again, and that can be an infinite loop that knocks all of our opponents out of the game, provided they don't have any way to stop the Redcap from dealing damage to them. Now, like I said, I know that my opinions of fun and cool interactions may be different than some other people, so if this is not an infinite combo that you would like to have in a deck, but you do want to put this deck together, in all honesty, I would recommend cutting the Murderous Redcap, because there are plenty of other things you can do with Thran Vigil, and Murderous Redcap is the thing that goes infinite and wins the game, so you can definitely find other things to do and replace it with, if that's something you're interested in doing. But I've mentioned this before, and I'll continue to mention it. I genuinely think that most decks, if not all decks probably, are worth having an infinite combo in there, just in case things get kind of gummed up in play. But anyway, that is only cool interaction number 1. We still have one more to go, and our second cool interaction is between Demon of Dark Schemes and Chthonian Nightmare. So, Demon of Dark Schemes, 3 black, black, black for a 5/5 demon. It's got flying. When it enters the battlefield, all other creatures get -2/-2 until the end of turn. Whenever another creature dies, you get an energy, and you may pay 3 mana and 4 energy to put target creature card from a graveyard onto the battlefield under your control, tapped. Then, we're going to partner that up with Chthonian Nightmare, 1 and a black for an enchantment. When it enters the battlefield, you get 3 energy. Then you can pay X energy and sacrifice a creature, and return the Chthonian Nightmare to its owner's hand to return target creature card with mana value X from your graveyard to the battlefield, but you can only activate it as a sorcery. Now, these are the only 2 energy cards in the deck, and I'll be honest, I didn't intend to put 2 separate energy cards that rely on each other. They're both just genuinely that good on their own. The demon being able to give us energy when things die, and then paying energy to put creatures from the graveyard onto the battlefield is incredibly powerful. The Chthonian Nightmare being able to constantly sacrifice creatures, bounce itself, reanimate creatures, then we can recast it, do it all over again. These can both on their own get completely out of hand. But then you keep in mind that the demon says whenever another creature dies, you get an energy. We have to sacrifice a creature with Chthonian Nightmare in order to activate its ability. This means that we technically get 4 energy from Chthonian Nightmare by just sacrificing a creature and putting something into play. This allows us to continuously get 1 more mana every time we activate the Nightmare, meaning we can eventually start resurrecting things that are massively powerful because we're not restricted to that 3 energy that Chthonian Nightmare makes. And that puts us in a position where we can reanimate pretty much anything in our graveyard, including the Demon of Dark Schemes if it winds up dying, as long as we can make enough energy beforehand. But like I said, these cards are both very powerful on their own, and I do think that they both earn a spot in the deck regardless of each other. But together they just make such a powerful engine that I definitely thought it was worth talking about. Moving on though, to our final piece of this deck tech, we of course have to talk about the price of the deck. And this week, the total deck price came in at $86 even, and a lot of that came from our most expensive card in the deck, which is Metamorphosis Fanatic at a massive $8.35. Now, Metamorphosis Fanatic is a very powerful card, and it was originally printed in a Commander Precon with Duskmourn, but it actually sees some legacy play, which is why it's risen so far up in price, because it is very powerful when you can manipulate the top card of your library, since it is 4 black for a 4/4 human cleric with lifelink. When it enters, return up to 1 target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield with a lifelink counter on it, and most importantly, Miracle for 1 and a black. So if we draw this card, and it's the first card we've drawn this turn, we can reveal it, cast it for 2 mana, and still get everything about it. That essentially means we have a 2 mana, 4/4 lifelinking creature that can reanimate any creature from our graveyard with a lifelink counter. There is no downside to this, there's no finality counters, there's no exiling, it just straight up gets whatever we want for possibly only 2 mana. And it's also not that bad for 6 mana, plus it also is just an enter the battlefield, it's not a cast trigger, so if we can reanimate the Fanatic, it can then reanimate something else, and we can kind of chain together a bunch of these reanimation effects that can put us in a position to win the game. Now, with that being said, this is one of those cards that if you do need to trim it for budget purposes, there are plenty of reanimation cards out there. I just think it's powerful enough that it deserves a spot if you can squeeze it in. On the other hand, if you're looking for a card to put into the deck that's a little bit outside of our normal budget, I do have a suggestion for you there as well, and the card that I would recommend replacing it with. So this week, if you're putting this deck together, I would also recommend putting in Whip of Erebos and removing Swift Warkite if that's an upgrade you want to make. Mainly because Whip of Erebos is 2 black for a legendary enchantment artifact. Creatures you control have lifelink, then you can pay 4 tap it and return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. It gains haste, exile it at the beginning of the next end step, and if it would leave the battlefield, exile it instead of putting it anywhere else, activate only as a sorcery. As I've mentioned, we have a lot of effects that care about creatures entering from the graveyard, so Whip of Erebos being able to do it for 4 mana pretty consistently and being reusable is very powerful in this deck. Plus, the lifelink is pretty solid too. It's nice to gain life and stay ahead of the curve. On the other hand, if you are putting a card in, obviously you do have to take a card out. So the card I would recommend taking out is Swift Warkite, which is 4 black-red for a 4/4 dragon with flying. When it enters the battlefield, you may put a creature card with CMC 3 or less from your hand or graveyard onto the battlefield. That creature gains haste. Return it to your hand at the beginning of the next end step. Now, originally this was in here to get the Phyrexian Dragon Engine, and then I kind of started looking through our list, and while we do have a fair amount of things that cost 3 or less, we don't have a ton of them. Plus, on the other hand, this is 6 mana, it's very difficult to cast, and it returns the thing that it reanimates to our hand, so it kind of just falls flat in multiple different ways. I was really excited for this card going into this. I really like the design of it, I like the art, and it just didn't quite do what I wanted it to do. So with that being said, I think Whip of Erebos is a better inclusion, but that's not to say Swift Warkite is terrible. I just don't think it does quite what we want it to do. But that brings us to the end of our deck tech, and before we get into a game with this deck, because we do have to see how this deck can perform in a game, I do want to take a second to shout out some of our patrons and channel members. A huge thank you to everyone who supports the channel. If you'd like to go above and beyond, you can find us over on Patreon, patreon.com/dungeonlearnersguide, and right here on YouTube as a channel member. But of course, you can always just like the video and subscribe to the channel. That does help out quite a bit. We're trying to make that push toward 2,000 subscribers, so if you could help us out, share this with your friends, I would really appreciate it. And of course, an extra special shout out goes to all of our patrons and channel members. So thank you to William Swiftfoot, Doodle, Eric Way, Ryder Cole, Jeffrey Boos, Vintage, Salty and Sunshine, Tyler Esme, Sven Van Nimwegen, Paddywhack, Keegan Tawney, Jakar, Galen, Brian Holiday, Richard, and the Oak Monster. So thank you all so much for all of your support. And without any further ado, let's check out our opponents for this week and then jump into our game. So this week we are joined by 3 opponents, and in this case it is Luke playing Prime Speaker Zagana, Jason playing Carador, Ghost Chieftain, and Cole playing King Makar the Gold Cursed. So starting off with Luke and his Prime Speaker Zagana list, you may have in the past seen his Yargle and Multani deck, you may have seen just his Multani deck. He's kind of set out to make a hand size matters deck for pretty much every color pairing that includes green. So this is of course his Simic attempt at it, and I would argue this is probably going to be the strongest given how good green and blue are at drawing cards. So Prime Speaker Zagana, really just here to get a massive creature, draw a ton of cards, and I'm not quite sure how we're going to fare against this. I imagine that a lot of Luke's power comes from having one giant creature, and our power is going to have a lot of recursion and kind of a bigger board of smaller creatures, so we'll see how that goes, but I'm sure it's going to be very powerful. Moving on to Jason and his Carador deck. This is an Aristocrat's Graveyard Synergy, and that is kind of Jason's specialty, so I'm always wary of Jason when he breaks out anything that has white and black in it, because I know that means there's going to be Zulaport Cutthroats and Blood Artists and a lot of Drain triggers, and I think that that's something that Mishra can actually help us out with. I think if Mishra can live, then we're able to probably gain enough life to stay in the game. But we'll definitely have to see, and I know Carador, very powerful, so we'll see how that one goes. And then last but not least, we have Cole and his King Makar the Gold Cursed deck. And this one is actually a vehicle deck. He wants to use King Makar to crew up some vehicles, and then he can untap King Makar on his turn, use the Inspired to exile any creature, make a gold token, ramp himself. So I think it's a really cool idea. But I would be lying if I said I wasn't afraid of King Makar. Exile is one of the worst things that our deck can see, so to see it stapled onto a commander, not great for us. Hopefully we'll have enough sacrifice outlets that we can sacrifice things instead of getting them exiled, but we'll see how that goes. Overall, let me know down in the comments who you think is going to walk out the winner for this game. Make sure you get your predictions in. But otherwise, I'm sure I'm going to have fun. I hope you all do as well. Please don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel. But let's jump into this game, and I will talk to you all once it's done. At the start of the game, Luke goes first, followed by Jason, Cole, and then myself. On Luke's first turn, he plays an island, then casts Ponder, looking at the top 3 cards of his library, putting them back in any order, and drawing a card. Jason plays a fortified village, revealing a forest so that it comes into play untapped. Cole plays a swamp. I play a swamp and then cast a Soul Ring. Luke plays an overflowing basin and casts Growth Spiral, drawing a card and putting a land, specifically a Garden of Freyalise, into play from his hand. Jason plays a swamp and then casts Zulaport Cutthroat, letting him gain a life while each of his opponents lose a life whenever a creature he controls dies. Cole plays a swamp and casts his own Soul Ring, then this lets him cast Brotherhood Vertibird, which has power equal to the number of artifacts he controls and has a crew cost of 2. On my turn, I play a mountain, then cast Canoptic Tomb Sentinel. Luke plays an island and casts Sylvan Library, now letting him draw 3 cards in his draw step and put up to 2 back on top, but for each card he chooses to keep, he has to pay 4 life. Jason plays a forest and then attacks Cole for 1 with the Cutthroat, and in his second main phase, Jason casts Wood Elves, searching his library for an Indatha Triome, putting it into play tapped. Cole plays a swamp and casts his commander, King Makar the Gold Cursed, which allows him to exile target creature and create a gold token whenever he becomes untapped. Cole immediately uses King Makar to crew the Vertibird and attacks Jason with it for 2. I play a swamp and cast Thought Vessel, gaining no maximum hand size, then I move to combat, attacking Cole for 4 with the Sentinels. In my second main phase, I cast Haunted Dead, creating a tapped 1/1 spirit token when it enters the battlefield. When Luke draws his 3 cards for his turn, he puts 1 back and pays 4 life to keep the other 2. He then plays a Breeding Pool untapped, paying 2 life, and cast Overbeing of Myth, which has power and toughness equal to the number of cards in his hand, and lets him draw an additional card in his draw step. Jason plays a Bountiful Promenade and attacks Cole for 2 with both of his creatures. Then, in his second main phase, Jason casts Shatter the Sky, destroying all creatures but letting each player who controls a creature with power 4 or greater draw a card, meaning Luke and I draw a card, while Jason gains a life and each of his opponents lose a life. On Cole's turn, he plays a Bojuka Bog, exiling Jason's graveyard, then casts Ancient Craving, drawing 3 cards and losing 3 life. Finally, he casts a Wayfarer's Bauble and passes. I play a swamp and cast Gravebreaker Lamia, making spells I cast from my graveyard cost 1 less to cast, and also searching my library for a card, in this case Technomancer, putting it into my graveyard. Once that resolves, I cast Animate Dead, enchanting the Technomancer, returning it to play and giving it -1/-0. When it enters, I mill 3 and return any number of artifact creature cards with total mana value 6 or less from my graveyard to the battlefield. This only gets back the Canoptic Tomb Sentinel, but since it enters from a graveyard, I get to exile target non-land permanent, exiling Luke's Sylvan Library. Luke plays a Miko Koro, Center of the Sea, and casts Big Horner Rancher, which can tap for green mana equal to the greatest power among creatures he controls, and can sacrifice itself to gain life equal to the greatest toughness among creatures he controls. Jason plays a swamp and casts Nyx Weaver, now milling 2 cards in his upkeep. Cole plays a swamp and recasts his commander, King Makar. On my turn, I cast my commander, Mishra claimed by Gix, making each of my opponents lose life while I gain life whenever I attack, equal to the number of attacking creatures I control. This lets me attack each of my opponents for 4, making them all lose 3 life while I gain 3, then Luke blocks with his Rancher, taking no damage, but I gain an additional 4 thanks to lifelink. Cole crews the Vertibird with Makar, using it to block, killing both creatures and also taking no damage, while Jason takes the 4. In my second main phase, I cast Chthonian Nightmare, getting 3 energy when it enters and letting me pay X energy, sacrifice a creature, and return the Nightmare to my hand to return a creature with mana value X or less from my graveyard to the battlefield. I immediately activate it, sacrificing the Tomb Sentinels, paying 3 energy, returning it to my hand, and returning Yahenni Undying Partisan from my graveyard to the battlefield. Notably, Yahenni can sacrifice a creature to give themselves indestructible until the end of turn, and gets a +1/+1 counter whenever an opponent's creature dies. On Luke's turn, he cast Imperial Plate, and immediately equips it to the Rancher, giving it +1/+1 for each card in his hand, which is currently 5. This lets him tap the Rancher for 7 mana, so he can cast his commander, Prime Speaker Zagana, entering with 7 +1/+1 counters since Luke controls a creature with 7 power, then letting him draw cards equal to her power, which is 8. Once that resolves, he also casts Spellbook, gaining no maximum hand size, and plays a Rejuvenating Spring. This then lets him cast Phantasmal Image, entering as a copy of Zagana, and although it dies to the Legend rule, it still enters with 12 counters, which means Luke draws another 13 cards. Finally, he casts a Fanatic of Ronus, and passes. In Jason's upkeep, he mills 2, then when he draws for turn, instead he dredges the Golgari Thug that he just milled, putting it into his hand and milling an additional 4 cards. He then casts the Golgari Thug, and also cast Kaya's Wrath, destroying all creatures, but letting him gain life equal to the number of creatures he controlled that were destroyed this way, which is 2. In response, I sacrifice both Mishra and the Lamia to Yahenni, giving them indestructible until the end of turn. Then the board wipe resolves, destroying all creatures, putting 6 counters on Yahenni, triggering the Golgari Thug, so Jason puts a Cursed Marauder from his graveyard on top of his library. On Cole's turn, he cast a Knight Paladin, doing 4 damage to each opponent when it enters. Then he also cast the Last Ride, which lets him pay 3 mana and 2 life to draw a card. Finally, he cast a Mind Stone and passes. I cycle a Desert of the Glorified, then attack Luke for 8 with Yahenni, and in my second main phase, I cast Goblin Engineer, searching my library for an artifact, specifically Terrian's Journal, putting it into my graveyard, and then also letting me activate the Engineer by tapping it, paying 3 mana to sacrifice an artifact, and return an artifact with mana value 3 or less from my graveyard to the battlefield. Luke plays a Dreamroot Cascade and casts Psychosis Crawler, which has power and toughness equal to the number of cards in his hand, and, more importantly, does 1 damage to each opponent whenever he draws a card. When Jason draws for his turn, he replaces the draw by dredging Golgari Thug, putting it into his hand, and milling 4, then he recast Golgari Thug. On Cole's turn, he cast Emergency Weld, returning Brotherhood Vertibird from his graveyard to his hand, and making a 1/1 artifact soldier token. After that, he recasts his commander, King Makar. On my turn, I play a mountain and recast Chthonian Nightmare, but Luke has an answer, countering it with Arcane Denial, and now letting him draw a card in the next upkeep, while I draw 2. Once that resolves, I cast a Rakdos Charm, destroying Luke's Psychosis Crawler since it's an artifact. In response, Luke again has a counterspell, casting an Offer You Can't Refuse. Before that can resolve though, this time Jason has a response, casting Beast Within to destroy Psychosis Crawler, giving him a 3/3 Beast token instead, putting a counter on Yahenni. Notably, this doesn't stop Luke's counterspell, so it still counters my Rakdos Charm and I get 2 treasures when it resolves. This lets me activate Goblin Engineer, sacrificing a treasure to return Tarian's journal from my graveyard to the battlefield. Then I activate the journal, discarding my hand, which is currently empty, to transform the journal into the Tomb of Aclazots, which can tap to let me cast a creature from my graveyard this turn, but if I do, it enters with a finality counter. Finally, I move to combat and attack Cole for 9 with Yahenni, but he blocks with his soldier token, killing it and taking no damage. In Luke's upkeep, he draws a card and I draw 2. He then equips his beast token with Imperial Plate, currently giving it +20/+20. After that, he casts Rishkar's Expertise, drawing 23 cards since he controls a creature with 23 power, and puts Sage of Ancient Lore into play from his hand, drawing a card when it enters, and it also has power and toughness equal to the number of cards in his hand, which is currently 43. Finally, he plays a Hinterland Harbor and passes. Jason cast an Altar of Dementia, allowing him to sacrifice a creature to mill target player equal to that creature's power. Then at the end of turn, Cole uses King Makar to crew the Brotherhood Vertibird. This allows him, when King Makar untaps on his turn, to exile Luke's Sage of Ancient Lore and make a gold token. In response though, Luke cast Essence Flux, exiling the Sage, returning it to play, drawing a card, saving it, and preventing Cole from making a gold. Once that's resolved, Cole casts Monumental Corruption, drawing 5 cards and losing 5 life since he controls 5 artifacts. After that, he casts Patriarch's Seal, which can be activated to untap target legendary creature. This lets him use King Makar to crew Knight Paladin and immediately use Patriarch's Seal to untap his commander, this time successfully exiling Sage of Ancient Lore and making a gold token. When I draw for my turn, I reveal the card that I draw, casting Metamorphosis Fanatic for its miracle cost, returning Technomancer from my graveyard to the battlefield with a lifelink counter. This then mills me for 3, and I return Canoptic Tomb Sentinels from my graveyard to the battlefield, exiling Luke's beast token when it enters. After all of that resolves, I use Tomb of Aclazots to cast Gravebreaker Lamia from my graveyard, entering with a finality counter, letting me search my library for Phyrexian Dragon Engine, putting it into my graveyard. Finally, I attack Luke for 9 with Yahenni, and then pass. Luke plays a forest and casts Jol Rayal, Voice of Zhalfir, letting him, at the start of combat, turn one of his lands into a bird creature with flying and haste that has power and toughness equal to the number of cards in his hand, also drawing a card when a land creature he controls deals combat damage to an opponent. This lets him turn Miko Koro into a 43 power creature, attacking Cole with it for 43 damage, and knocking him out of the game. Before he's eliminated though, Cole casts Flare of Malice, sacrificing King Makar to make each opponent sacrifice a creature they control with the greatest mana value. In response, Jason sacrifices Golgari Thug to the Altar of Dementia, milling himself for 1, then the Flare resolves, killing Jol Rayal and the Technomancer, also putting 3 more counters on Yahenni. In his second main phase, Luke casts Morrow, which has power and toughness equal to the number of cards in his hand, and cast Ivory Tower, gaining life in his upkeep equal to the number of cards in his hand -4. When Jason draws for turn, he dredges Golgari Thug, returning it to his hand and milling 4. He then casts his commander Carador Ghost Chieftain, letting him cast a creature from his graveyard once a turn. He then casts a Cursed Marauder from his graveyard, making each player sacrifice a non-token creature, but Luke has a response, countering it with Foil. At the end of turn, I activate my Goblin Engineer, sacrificing a treasure to return Swiftfoot Boots from my graveyard to the battlefield. On my turn, I play a Buried Ruin and then recast my commander Mishra, immediately equipping him with the Swiftfoot Boots, giving him hexproof and haste. After that, I use Tomb of Aclazots to cast Phyrexian Dragon Engine from my graveyard, discarding my hand and drawing 3. I then move to combat and attack Luke for 8 with the Tomb Sentinels and the Lamia, and also attack Jason for 20 with the rest of my board. On attacks, each of my opponents lose 6 life, and I gain 6 life thanks to Mishra. Then Jason blocks Yeheni with Carador, killing his commander and putting another counter on Yeheni, but meaning he only takes 8 damage, while Luke blocks the Lamia, exiling it, gaining me 8 life, then he still takes 4 damage, getting knocked out of the game. When Jason draws for his turn, he dredges life from the loam, returning it to his hand and milling 3. He then casts the life from the loam, returning Command Tower, Woodland Cemetery, and a forest from his graveyard to his hand. Unfortunately, since I'm about to meld Mishra and the Dragon Engine into Mishra lost to Phyrexia on my turn, Jason doesn't see a way to survive, so he decides to concede, winning me the game. Alright, so that was a sweet game. Definitely a lot going on in that game, and I think everyone's deck kind of got the chance to showcase what it could do. We just had a little bit more value than the rest of the table, and I think a lot of that came from Luke kind of drawing a lot of aggro in this game. By the end of the game, when he got knocked out, he had over 40 cards in his hand, had multiple creatures that were absolutely giant and lethal threats, so I think that he was definitely putting himself in a position to win the game. And if we hadn't eliminated him on the turn that we did, he would have untapped with Ivory Tower and quite literally gained 40 life. So it's not beyond the realm of possibility to say that that was our one chance to knock him out, because I don't think we were going to get there otherwise. So definitely a very cool showing by Luke. I think that being able to draw those cards and kind of use Green's ability to draw cards based on creatures' power was super, super cool. And I'm sure that as he continues through this series of decks, it's going to get even more kind of wacky, but also very powerful. Just hand size effects tend to naturally be very strong. Moving around the table, we get to Jason and his Carador deck. He didn't quite get to pop off in the way that I'm sure he was hoping to. He kind of played the role of the world police sitting at this table. He cast multiple board wipes, made sure that he was constantly making us sacrifice creatures, putting us in a position where we didn't really get to build up our board state as much as we would like. And unfortunately for Luke and for Cole, that didn't affect us quite as much as it did them. Being able to reanimate our creatures meant that we didn't really care if they died. We were still able to keep our value train going, where it kind of just kept resetting Cole and Luke. So I actually think that we benefited the most from the board wipes in this game. And then, of course, Cole, very impressive deck. I think it was super cool to see a lot of the mono black artifact synergies. It's definitely an archetype that I've looked at before, but with some recent sets, especially Aether Drift, I think it's definitely worth looking at again. And I think having King Makar as a vehicle commander is very powerful. You may have noticed in the game that we kept killing his commander. It really only started to untap toward the end of the game because we were just so afraid of it just exiling our things. None of us really wanted our stuff to get exiled. None of us wanted to help ramp Cole. So it was kind of a spooky commander, even though it didn't really look like much at first. And then last but not least, of course, our deck did exactly what it wanted to do. It just kind of kept looping creatures in and out of the graveyard. And I will say I was nervous going into this that we weren't going to be able to reanimate as much as I was hoping. But after seeing the way that we could just kind of keep getting Technomancer and keep getting other things like the Canoptic Tomb Sentinels, it really just showcased how good reanimation synergies are and how much more efficient they've gotten since the beginning of Magic. Because I've definitely done Rakdos Reanimator decks in the past that were good, but this just felt more efficient in a way that even a deck from a couple years ago doesn't seem like it could quite match up with. So I think that's something to be aware of with this deck. But overall, it was a ton of fun. I think, like I said, very efficient, very powerful, and I think there's definitely upgrades that could be made. So if there's any cards you think could be added to the list, or maybe cards that I put in that shouldn't be there, please do let me know down in the comments. I do love hearing people's opinions on the decks, because that's kind of the fun of Commander, is we get to be a little creative and have that gathering part of Magic the Gathering. So thank you all so much for watching. If you have any suggestions for future videos, please do put those in the comments as well. I love building decks. It's genuinely why I started this channel, so I'd love to get suggestions. But overall, thank you so much for watching. Please don't forget to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and I will see you all on the other side of the Dungeon Learner's Guide.